Greetings. In this video, we will discuss just a very basic facial rig. In order to rig using this basic method, we'll create a blend shape deformer, a cluster deformer, and we'll use SetDriven to drive those facial rig. Before we jump into the actual face itself, let's tackle each one of those three independently: SetDriven key, cluster deformer, and blend shape deformer. And if you wanted to go to the help and look up any one of those three for even greater detail, that would be a good idea. Let's start first with the SetDriven. The SetDriven allows us to automate any type of repetitive action. I am going to create a door, and we'll imagine that a customer is coming through and that this automatic door is opening. I'm going to put the pivot, right D key to change the pivot, C key, and my middle mouse button will snap that there. That'll allow us to snap this up, and we'll place it about there. And once again, I'll go D key. In this case, I'll go X key, and just get that right where we would imagine a hinge is. And this door will open, and I'm going to make it a little bit thinner. So we'll create an automated door that automatically opens when our imagined character comes close or walks through. I'll also turn on my wireframe, and let's just use a sphere as a stand-in. We'll imagine that this character is walking through and the door will open. Let's make that an even 5. And we'll make the translate Z, this is the positive direction. Let's start at, let's say 10. So when translate Z of the polysphere is 10, the door will be closed. The rotate Y, and you can verify the axis, the rotate Y will be 0. And we'll establish that point, and it will exist on a graph that's independent of the timeline. Let's begin. We'll, in the animation mode, come up to key, SetDriven, set, animation mode, key, SetDriven, set. And we have driver and driven, and we'll need to load those. So our sphere is the driver. We'll load the driver. And our cube is the driven. We'll load the driven. Polysphere, which attribute is it? Well, translate Z. So we'll come to translate Z for the polysphere. And yeah, so polysphere, translate Z, which is currently 10. And then the cube, rotate Y, which is currently 0. So when polysphere translate Z equals 10, we want polycube rotate Y to equal 0. Note that you can click off and the attribute can become deselected. So each time you hit key, make sure that you've got the driver and the attribute, the driven and the attribute highlighted, and then your key will work. In just a moment here, hitting key doesn't have anything to do with the timeline as it relates to SetDriven. In fact, if this word here was establish or mark, that might be a better descriptor, because saying key can be confusing. You imagine that hitting key is setting keys in the timeline. That's different than when we come up to the menu and say set key or hit S on the keyboard. So the key function in the SetDriven key doesn't have to do with the timeline. It's creating an independent graph of relationship, vertically the driven and horizontally the driver. And it's establishing those 2 points and then being able to have the driver, as it changes value, change the value of the driven running vertically. So let's establish that first one. Just once again, polysphere translate Z equals 10. Polycube rotate Y equals 0, and we'll key it. Note, nothing happens in the timeline. There are no red in our channel box. This is independent of the timeline. Let's grab our driver, our sphere, or we're imagining a supermarket customer, and we'll put that at 0, right? Walking through the door. And then we want the door to open, so we'll come and pick the door here, and we'll rotate that 90 degrees. In fact, let's have it open all the way. We'll say 180. It opens, swings all the way around. And now we want to establish that by hitting the key. And if we grab the sphere, that is now automated. As the character, right, is out beyond 10, nothing's happening. As soon as it gets to 10, it's 10, right? The value of translate Z is driving the rotate Y of the cube. Then, of course, we can come all the way out. Let's say we go -10, and we want the door to shut. So polysphere translate Z equals -10. We'll come to polycube, rotate Y, and we'll set that back to 0. And we'll hit key. We'll establish that by hitting key. And we can see now that we've got an automated action, right? This door opens, the translate, the rotate Y of the door is being driven by the translate Z of the sphere. So give that a shot. You want to be able to do this because we'll be using the SetDriven key in a little bit more sophisticated way, a little bit more challenging way. So you want to get this under your belt, be able to do it without following the instructions, just having one attribute drive another. Let's look at this in the graph editor before we proceed. Window, Animation Editor, Graph Editor. And if I pick the driven, we'll see that. So you can see here is the 180 running vertically. The driven is running vertically. And then here are the values of the driver, the sphere, right? So when the sphere is -10, the rotate Y is 0. When the sphere is at 0, right, it's at 180. And then when the sphere comes back to -10, oh, excuse me, these are the values of the rotate Y. When that comes back, this is now set to 0. So our Y value, in this case, our Y value rotate of the cube is here. And I should have been pointing up here, sorry. And then here is the running horizontally, the sphere translate Z value, -10, 0, 0, 180, and then +10 back to 0. So we have it horizontally running up here. I was pointing down here and forgot that the numbers are running along the top. Okay. Let's talk about the SetDriven in a more applicable way that we'll be using it for our facial rig. I'm going to go ahead and delete that sphere, and we're going to create a locator. So if we come to create locator, and this gives us what's also referred to as a null node. It's a node that has translate, rotate, and scale. It doesn't render. If we were to render this, we wouldn't see this node. But we can use it for any number of things. We can use it as a controller. We can use it as a method of constraint. In this case, we'll use it to apply the attributes of our SetDriven. So let's say we didn't want a character driving the door open and close, but we were going to be creating an animation where the door is opening and closing all of the time. And we could select it and key it, but it would be easier if we just captured that from 0 to 180 one time, and we could just animate that with the flip of a switch, really. And that is what we'll do now. We'll come to Modify, Add Attribute. Modify, Add Attribute. We're adding the attribute to our locator. And we'll call this door open. So if 0 means the door is closed, 1 would mean the door is open. So our attribute door open will give it a minimum value of 0 and a maximum value of 1, and it will start at 0. So door open 0, door open 1, and then it's going to start here. That was modify, add attribute. We're calling this door open. The minimum value is 0, the maximum value is 1, and I'll hit OK. Now, if you look over here, here is your locator, and here is a new attribute that we just created called door open. So let's have door open drive that Y rotate. We'll come back to our SetDriven, set. We'll load the driver, in this case it's the locator, and we want to pick the door open attribute. We'll pick the door and load it as the driven, and we know that it's rotate Y. And we're just creating this relationship in that graph, right? Vertically is the driven, horizontally is the driver. So locator, door open equals 0. We want the door closed. We'll establish that by hitting key. Now we'll come to locator, door open, and we'll say 1, on, right? Door open is on. The switch has been flipped. And we'll come to polycube, rotate Y, and we'll make that 180. And we'll hit key. We'll establish that by hitting key. And now we have this locator, and we can click on that attribute, and you can scrub that attribute, door open, right? Here is door open at 0, here is door open at 1, and there's all the in-between increments. And we could key this, and throughout the scene, now this doesn't give us too big of a benefit. We could pretty easily just come and grab this cube and animate the rotate Y. But if you wanted to be very precise, it's going from 0 to exactly 180, right? You don't have to type in 180. You can just scrub this open, scrub it closed, and you can set keys directly on it. One other thing, because we have this driver here, we don't need the transform information or the visibility. We can come to Windows, General Editors, Channel Control, Window General Editors, Channel Control, and we can remove all of those attributes. So we'll pick it all. We want door open there. We'll pick all the transform attributes and including visibility, and we'll hit move. So now we have a clean door open. We can just pick that, type in 1, the door is open. We could come into the timeline, let's say at frame 40, we want the door closed, and then at frame 50, we want the door open, and we can key that, and now we've got that repetitive task. Set on a controller. And this is what we'll use for our face. We will create a locator, we'll call it character control, and it will drive a host of deformers, and we can create preset expressions. Typically we start off with surprised and angry or happy and sad, just two kind of binary expressions. And we'll have an attribute called happy, an attribute called sad, and we'll key multiple deformers in order to create each of those expressions. And then when we go to animate, it's simple enough to just key angry, key sad, surprised or happy, whatever the expression is, rather than having to go and select all those multiple deformers and with great precision place them in order to create those expressions. So this will be a great time saver for us. Give that a shot. You'll want to take a moment and try this both ways, just where the sphere is driving the door open and closed, and then use this locator method where we create an attribute called door open. And we have door open 0, the door is closed, door open 1, the door is open, driving the rotate Y of that cube 180 degrees. Give that a shot. We'll come back and we'll pick up talking about deformers. Okay, let's continue. We'll talk about the two deformer systems that we'll use to animate our facial rig. If you're in the modeling mode, you can come out to deform, and we'll limit ourselves initially just to the first two. You could rig a face directly using just the cluster method, But because we're going to have our head attached to a more complex rig, we'll actually cluster the blend shape targets. So let's talk about clusters and blend shapes first in isolation, and then I'll show you how we'll use them together to create a very effective rig. A cluster is really very much like soft select, but it allows you to capture a set of vertices and then to weight those vertices. So you know that soft select, if we grab, let's say this vertex here, and we tap the B key, whenever we see that yellow to red, we know soft select is on. I can hold the B key and scrub left, right to change that size. And if we were making some type of shape, right, we could do that. But let's say we wanted to capture this set of vertices with this exact weight. That's when we would employ a cluster. So I'm going to undo that. We'll get it back. And let's pick a set of vertexes. Let's say most of the top half. Now, if I was to move that, you see that you just get a one-to-one correlation. And when we create the cluster, by default, that's what it is, just a one-to-one correlation of the set of vertexes that you have selected. But we're also able to weight those. And let's create the cluster and talk about weighting it. So I've got these selected. Always a good idea to hit the 4 key and see what you're creating the cluster from. Sometimes you'll have vertexes that you don't want selected, have been inadvertently selected. So good idea to hit the 4 key and just dolly around and see. And then we'll say deform cluster. It gives you a little C, and it's a little bit hard to select. If you look up here, right, deformers are one down from surfaces. So if I have a surface and a deformer in the same area and I go to pick it, I'll get the surface. We could turn on a handle for that, but for this initial lesson, we'll just select it here in the outliner. So have your outliner available. I can grab my cluster handle, and you see that we move that up. If I hit the wireframe, it's just moving all of those vertexes at a one-to-one correlation, right? So we want to weight those vertexes the same way that we have that weighting in soft select. Now the trick is that there's a few things that are a little quirky. We don't have the cluster selected when we want to paint it. Oftentimes, and it's intuitive that you would have that selected. It's actually the surface that you have selected, the geometry. So with that selected, we'll come up to deform. Right, the first two that we are going to create cluster, we just created one blend shape. But if you come all the way down to paint weights, you see that blend shape and cluster are listed down here as paint weights. So we'll come to paint weights for the cluster, and we have a black and white. Black is 0 off, white is on, and what we want is really gray in here. Now the tool settings, my tool settings are in this box next to outliner. Yours will open, right? If you hit cluster paint weights dialog box, that should open for you. And we have some paint operations here. Smooth, you're almost always using with the cluster. And you can paint the smooth, that is for sure, but we're going to flood it. So I'm going to come to flood, and you see that it's creating gray in there. And we'll just click this a number of times until we get a nice gray. So I'm not painting gray, I'm just flood smoothing it. And now when we come back to that cluster, I'm selecting it in the outliner, and we pull it, we have that same fall off that we had with soft select. But unlike soft select, we can come back and pick this cluster as many times as we want, and we can set keys on it. So if this was some action that was going to be repetitive, you were having some shape that was doing this, and you created that cluster, you could weight it, and now you get this nice fall off, and you could set keys on that cluster handle itself. So give that a shot. Grab some vertexes, come up to deform, create cluster. Then you want to paint the weights, so we'll come to the surface, right? Not the deformer itself, which is a little confusing. Not the cluster itself, but the polysphere. We'll come to deform all the way down to cluster paint weights dialog box. And then with smooth selected, we hit flood a number of times, and that softened it. On our character's face, the eyebrows, right, you want to have a nice soft fall off, the jaw, the lids. So all of the clusters that we incorporate for our facial rig, we'll want to smooth those edges so that we get a nice organic movement to those elements. Yeah, so give that a shot, and then we'll come back and we'll talk about blend shape deformers. Okay, so blend shapes, we have a target and a base shape. So let's imagine we've got our sphere here. Let's say this is going to be our target, and we'll duplicate this. And one of the caveats for the blend shape is that the target and the base have to have the exact same number of components. I couldn't say, for instance, add an edge loop to one and not the other. It has to have the same number. But we can come and let's use that soft select method. Let's say we just wanted to make some kind of blob animation happen. So we could just pick a series here and we'll kind of move these things out. And we'll create the blend shape that will, some applications refer to it as a tween, and that's a good word for it. It will tween between these two positions. So here's our shape. I'm going to turn off the grid, and let's just move this over a little bit more. And selection order is important. Your base is always selected last, because we could actually create a whole series. I could make 10 of these and pick the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and then as long as this was shift selected last, the base, the blend shape will work. So selection order, the target, this is the target, and this is the base, shift select the base, and we'll come up to deform blend shape. Deform blend shape. Now, it doesn't appear as though anything has happened. We'll need to come to the editor. Window, animation editors, and it's under shape editor. Shape editor. In some of the older tutorials on the previous versions, it was called blend shape editor, but now it's just been shortened to shape editor. And we'll open that, and it just gives us a slider. So here is that polysphere, and I can pull that left and right, and we have that action happen. A couple of things, we can, as long as we've got the target, we can update it. So sometimes you might execute a target and you want to come and make additional changes. It's remembering that, right? And we can go back to 0, back to 1. And then this is saved. We could even come and delete that. We could delete the target. Typically don't want to, just put it on a layer and hide it away for flexibility, but just to demonstrate we could delete that, but it still remembers that, right? Let's just get a smooth preview there. So we can scrub back and forth between the blend base and the blend target. Now, the shape editor is not the most convenient thing to have available to set keys. You can key it directly, but the way that we'll incorporate it is similar to how we ended with the SetDriven. Let's come and create a locator, and we'll put this locator up here. Here it is listed. We know that we can come to Windows, General Editors, Channel Control. We'll get rid of everything, and we'll hit Move. We'll move that all over so there's nothing there on my locator. Let's add an attribute, modify, add attribute. Let's just call this blob, and we'll say 0 is no blob, 1 is blob, the default is 0, and we'll hit OK. Now, of course, nothing happens if we type 1 here. We haven't plugged it in via the SetDriven. So I created a locator, gave it an attribute, blob0, blob1, and then we'll come in the animation mode to key, SetDriven, set, animation mode, key, SetDriven, set, and the Locator1 blob is going to be our driver, and we're not picking the sphere here. to put in the driven, we have to select the shape editor. And in the last few versions of Maya, this has been a little bit different. So if you're coming from a previous set of tutorials, note that this is different here. In order to select the blend shape so that we can key it in the SetDriven key dialog box, we have to right-click it here and say select. So I've right-clicked blend shape 1 in the shape editor and I'm choosing select. And now I can say load driven, blend shape 1. It gives us this attribute, and polysphere is what we want to drive. So we'll put polysphere. Now, if you're wondering, this really isn't giving us much of an advantage. You could just key this rather than set this up and key this. That is true. But as soon as we have two things that we want to add, and then three, and then four, this method becomes much more efficient. So if I were just keying, this single attribute, this wouldn't make a lot of sense. But I'm demonstrating it because we will be adding additional um, driven to our singular driver. So I've got this here selected, locator blob equals 0, blend shape 1, polysphere 2 equals 0, and I'll establish that by hitting key. Now we'll come to locator 1 blob equals 1, and we'll make blend shape sphere 2 equal 1, and we'll establish that by hitting key. And so now we don't have to open the shape editor, right? We don't have to worry about the shape editor. We can just continue to put additional attributes on this locator, and it will control our scene, right? If I put that at 0, it's back down. We can click it and scrub. I'm not getting a nice smooth scrub. So we can scrub that back and forth between 0 and 1. We can key it. So let's say at frame 1, we wanted the blob at 0. We'll key it. At frame 30, we'll put that up to 1 and key it. And then frame 60, back down to 0. And we'll key it. And then we could play that animation. Right. So two things that we're seeing here. We have a blend shape. We had that target blobby shape that we deformed. Our base shape, the sphere. We had the target selected first. We shift selected the base. We went up to deform, create blend shape. And then in the blend shape editor, let me just say that again. We went up to deform blend shape. Then we came to the window animation editor shape editor, and we saw that there. And now we've done one additional thing where we created a locator, we added an attribute called blob, and via the SetDriven key dialog box, we're having it drive this shape editor deformer. So give that a shot. Play with just creating the blend shape first, and then play with creating the locator, adding the attribute, and using the SetDriven to drive the shape editor. Next little section of the video, we'll put it all together. Okay, let's put it all together. We have talked about SetDriven key, we've talked about cluster deformers, we've talked about blend shape deformers. Let's incorporate these three workflows together to create what we will be doing for a facial rig. We'll just use a simple sphere and just a single cluster for this. For your face, you'll have clusters for your brows, for your lids, for your jaw, perhaps even for your cheeks, any other element of the face that you want to deform. We'll just use a single cluster deformer as we warm up here on our sphere. Just a quick review. I want to grab, let's say, the top half of vertexes, and we'll come up to, and I don't want to be in soft select, just I have them selected, right? When I move the cluster initially, that's how it will move. So we'll come up to deform, create cluster, and this time we want to open the dialog box. So as we proceed, the method that we're using for all of our, what you might call offset facial rigging, we want to have the cluster set to relative. The initial example, because we were just moving this in position, in place, it didn't matter that we didn't have relatives selected. But we're going to be moving these clusters, offsetting them, and offsetting them from the ultimate rig. So we need to make sure that our clusters are relative. Clusters are set to relative. If you skip this step, you won't be able to follow later on. So very important that relative is selected. We'll create that, and now we have this cluster, and it's just moving everything at 1 to 1. We want to paint weights, and you would think that you would have the cluster selected when you went to paint weights, but you have the geometry selected when you go to paint weights. And so we'll come up in the modeling mode, deform, all the way down to cluster, right? We created the cluster here, but we'll come all the way down to paint weights, cluster weights. And you see, right, where it's white, that is giving you 1. Where it's black, it's off, no effect. And we would just want to create some gray in here. And rather than paint directly, you see my paint brush, I could hold the B key, make that brush larger or smaller, and actually paint on it. And we eventually will. But for this simple example, we're just going to hit flood several times. Click that a bunch of times. And as soon as we see a fair amount of gray there, we'll come back to the outliner, pick our cluster, and now, right, we get that nice soft gradation. And we could scale that, we can rotate it, right? So we've got that weighted cluster, which is what we were after. You will create all the clusters on your face in this central position. And now we're going to do something that will take some explanation. And it may not make sense to you until we're at the very end of the rigging process, whether that's on your bipedal character or on your jack-in-the-box head. The reason that we're creating this offset rig is to give us flexibility for the ultimate rig that the head is sitting on. We don't want the clusters, we don't want the facial rig itself to be carried around with the character. We want to have that in a central location with a central set of controls. And so that's what we're doing as we proceed here. We're giving ourselves that set of controls that are separate from the head, and that gives us the flexibility to rig the head in any number of ways. And our facial rig won't conflict with our the bipedal or the spring rig for the jack-in-the-box. So that's why we're doing this. May not make sense here initially, but once you get to the very end of the project, you'll see why we are choosing this method. I want to select these two objects and group them. So we'll come to group, right? So group 1 contains the sphere and the cluster. I can move that anywhere that I wanted. But we did that so that we can now come and duplicate. So we're coming to Edit Duplicate Special. And you want duplicate input graph, right? When you open this, by default, everything's available. We're going to come to duplicate input graph, not connections, but graph. And we'll hit duplicate, and then now all that information comes. We've got this new group, group 2, and we can move this over here. And my cluster, you want to test it, right? My cluster works here. And we're going to put this cluster up here and just execute it. Let's do all, we'll even kind of scale that down. And this is going to be our blend shape target. We're not going to have our cluster, and I'll come back here and I'm going to hit delete actually, just so that there's no confusion. So we created that in place. Typically you'll have your head sitting at the origin. You'll create all the clusters for the facial rig. Then we'll duplicate it, and we're going to use all the clusters, in this case we just have a single cluster, on the blend shape target. That will give us lots of flexibility for the original head, and we can use this in a variety of rigging situations. And the clusters won't run into conflict with those additional rigging features. That's why we're doing this as an offset. The blend shape is very clean and very easy for the computer to calculate, and typically there aren't any problems if you're using this blend shape method, and so that's why we're doing it. So let's create our blend shape. I want to pick my object and have an eye in the outliner, polysphere, and I'll shift select the base, and we'll come up and we'll create our blend shape. So we'll say deform blend shape. Doesn't appear as though anything happens, but we can come over to Windows, Animation Editors, Shape Editor, and here it is, right? So I'm going between those two. We know that we can come and do things after the fact. If I wanted this to be the target, or I wanted, oops, let me just grab that, right? We wanted to rotate that, or we wanted to scale it, right? It's happening after the fact. So here is our target. It's got our cluster on it, and we're having it drive that there. Now let's create our locator. So we're going to say create locator. We'll put this up here. We'll add an attribute. Let's just call it egg. We'll say egg. We'll say 0 is sphere, 1 is egg, and we'll hit OK. We can get rid of all of these in our view. So we'll say Windows, General Editors, Channel Control. I'll grab everything except for egg, and we'll move it over. We'll open our SetDriven. We know that that is in the animation mode, key, SetDriven, set, locator, egg, is going to drive the blend shape editor. And so in order to load the blend shape editor in here, it's an added step. We'll open it, Windows, Animation Editors, Shape Editor. And in order to select this, to put it in here, to hit Load Driven, we're right-clicking Blend Shape 1 and saying Select. And now I can say Load Driven, and now we can select this slider. So Locator 1, egg, equals 0. Make sure they're both selected. Blend Shape Polysphere equals 0. And we'll establish that by hitting key. Now locator egg equals 1. We want blend shape 1 polysphere to equal 1, and we'll key it. Establish it by hitting key. Now we don't have to open the shape editor anymore. Our cluster won't interfere when we ultimately rig this shape into a more complex rig. And we can just grab this, and if your middle mouse button allows you to scrub, you can go back and forth. And of course, I could even delete that, and this still works. I'm going to undo that and undo the delete, and just demonstrate that, or help you to see why this method is preferred. Let's say we wanted to add some additional deformation here. We could grab our target, and let's say we wanted to add a lattice to it. And we wanted, right, to be able to use this lattice, maybe it rotates it or scales it. Let's say it scales it. And even maybe pulls it down, something like that. And of course, this just updates. So this can be anywhere in the scene, right? This could be way over there. It could be rotated itself. It could be constrained to a rig, right? It can be anywhere in any position. It could have additional rigging features added to it. And we can very quickly come and change these attributes. And if we want to make a change, we don't have to come out into the animated scene. We just come to the target, and you're typically having this hidden away on a layer, right? And so you're out in your scene and you say, you know what, that's too pointy. I don't need it that pointy. You can come back to your target, pick whatever deformation means you've selected, and maybe you say, oh, we wanted it to go that way. So you're doing it here, nice world space, easy to see, easy to manipulate, easy to add additional rigging features to. get rid of that, and then your target out here in the animated scene will update. And you can even just scrub back and forth out there with that variable uh, base shape. Okay, give that a shot, and when you're able to do those three things, create your blend shape targets, and weight a cluster, and you're also able to use the SetDriven and a locator with a new attribute added to drive those things, then you're ready to rig a basic face, and we'll pick that up in the next video.